British government has a set of rules that say, and they're a reflection of EU rules, a reflection of international law, that say things like you can't license arms for exports if they might be used in internal repression, if they might be used in serious violation of international humanitarian law, if they might be used to extend conflicts. So all these kind of lists of things that, if the criteria whereby if the licensing of that item for export violates any of those criteria, then the arms can't be sold, in theory. However, Britain continues to sell arms to the Gulf regimes, which can clearly be used for internal repression. It's sometimes the case that Britain sells the arms and then something terrible happens in the country and Britain revokes the arms export licences after the fact, which shows that they shouldn't have been selling them in the first place. So in theory, the controls are quite strict, but in practice they're just violated constantly. Everything we know suggests that Saudis have been involved in serial violations of international humanitarian law, indiscriminate attacks on civilian targets. It means hitting schools, it means hitting hospitals, camps for displaced persons. It's hard to document exactly what precise piece of kit was used for what precise thing, but what we do know is that the Saudis and the Emiratis have been committing these acts, and we know that half the Saudi Air Force is British fighter jets. So the idea that somehow, having spent 3 years committing one atrocity after another and using British kit throughout, that no physical pieces of British kit were involved is unlikely. The Saudis have been saying to the government, oh, these are all terrible mistakes, we're doing our best to rectify them. If they keep happening, they're still happening. Indiscriminate attacks are still being documented, but for 3 years the Saudis have been saying, oops, isn't it terrible, we're doing our best to stop it. It's best not to think of arms sales to Saudi Arabia as a purely commercial thing, because it's not purely commercial, it's very much a state-to-state relationship. So the British government really strongly supports the British arms industry with all kinds of subsidies and all the rest of it, including British ministers, in a way acting as kind of salespersons. They will go out there on a British diplomatic visit and talk about various diplomatic things to do with security and all the rest of it, but also say, would you like to buy these weapons that we have? With the demise of the British Empire, Britain wanted to remain a global power, and it wanted to base that power in part on its military strength, its ability to project military power worldwide. Now, to be a military power, you need a domestic arms industry. Sales to the Gulf account for about half of British arms sales, which means that we're getting more and more dependent on those big arms contracts with the Saudis and the Emiratis to sustain the British arms industry in terms of those exports. It's basically, the fact is that there's export markets in the rest of the world are drying up, whereas the Gulf states are the big arms importers still, world leading. The Japanese government could decide to have some very strong arms export controls that had restrictions on end use. So saying that you can't sell arms if they're going to end up, after a couple of stages in a certain place. But without those controls being effective rather than just words on paper, you can't trust the British not to sell on to, as we've found, because British arms controls, it's been demonstrated over the last few years conclusively, they're worthless. If the British can sell arms to the Saudis while the Saudis are behaving as they are in Yemen now, then the British will sell arms to anyone, anywhere. If you're going to take end use seriously, don't collaborate with the British. If you look at the market worldwide, as I said before, it's declining in the rest of the world. The real big arms market is the Middle East. Who's buying those arms? It's the Gulf states. Even if you wanted to sell arms to people who just indiscriminately kill civilians in Yemen, even if you thought that was a good idea, you can't break into those markets. Those markets are dominated by the British and the French and the Americans. I can't see who Japan is going to sell to and outside of the Gulf, and I can't see it breaking into those markets either. So it doesn't seem to be a sensible strategy on any level. Britain has never really drawn a line under its imperial history and moved on and tried to play a more constructive role in the world. Instead, we've tried to hang on to that history. We've attempted to project military power worldwide, and we've ended up being a country that sells arms to all sorts of terrible regimes, a country that gets involved in aggressive wars in places like Iraq. What have we achieved by doing that? We've destabilised the Middle East, we've made ourselves vulnerable to terrorist threats, we've unbalanced our economy, we've morally implicated ourselves in all sorts of terrible situations. I, as a person who is deeply questioning the British imperial legacy and British militarism, find it sad to see a formerly imperial country that has, it seems to me, done the right thing, now considering doing the wrong thing after having made that achievement. Don't do what we're doing. For all the reasons I've said. Don't start selling arms to regimes like Saudi Arabia. Look at the moral cost of it. Look at the human cost of what it is that the British are doing. This is what it means to be an arms dealer. It means being morally complicit in the sort of atrocities we've been seeing in Yemen, the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. Britain is deeply morally implicated in this tragedy where thousands of people have lost their lives, innocent people, a huge amount of suffering. That's what it means to be an arms dealer. It's not just about making a bit of money. It means at the end of the day, when these terrible things happen, the blood's on your hands.